There's a special kind of aircraft that deserves our attention, not because it was brilliant, not because it changed aviation forever, but because it represents one of the most spectacular, what were they thinking moments in Cold War fighter design. The Vought F7U Cutlass looked like it came straight out of a 1950s science fiction magazine. Sleek, futuristic, absolutely stunning. It was also a death trap. This is the story of an aircraft designed by people who were so enamored with their own delta wing concept that they forgot one crucial detail. Pilots actually have to survive flying the thing. Welcome back to Overlooked Origins. Today we're talking about one of aviation's greatest embarrassments, a fighter so fundamentally broken that it makes you wonder how it ever got past the drawing board. This is the Vought F7U Cutlass. Let's rewind to the mid-1940s. The jet age is in full swing. The Soviets are getting scary, and American aircraft designers are looking closely at what other nations are doing, specifically Germany. Germany had been experimenting with radical swept and delta wing concepts during the war, so naturally, American companies took some inspiration. One of these companies was Vought, which saw an opportunity to bring that futuristic look and performance to the US Navy. In June 1945, the Navy launched a competition for a new carrier-capable day fighter. It had to be fast, modern, and jet-powered. Vought's engineers believed that a tailless, swept-wing configuration could leapfrog the competition. Officially, Vought denied German influence on their design. But come on. All it takes is one glance at aircraft like the Messerschmitt P1112, and yeah. Add in the fact that Waldemar Voigt, who was a former senior designer from Messerschmitt, joined the team and helped with the design, and the connection is more or less undeniable. But anyways, lead designer Rex Beazle, already famous for the Vought F4U Corsair, wanted to create something revolutionary. His team envisioned a next-generation carrier fighter with no horizontal tail, twin engines buried deep in the fuselage, and aggressively swept wings. The result was the Vought XF7U-1 Cutlass, a jet that looked less like a fighter and more like it had fallen out of a pulp science fiction cover. It was sleek, clean, and fucking beautiful. On paper, it was everything the Navy dreamed of. But behind that futuristic silhouette was a major problem. The technology of the late 40s and early 50s simply wasn't ready for what Vought was trying to build. So let's take a deeper look at this radical design. For starters, no horizontal stabilizer, no tail wing, just a pure delta wing configuration with minimal vertical control surfaces. The idea was that the delta wing itself would handle pitch and roll control, keeping the aircraft clean and aerodynamic. Theoretically, less drag equals faster performance. Theoretically. 2 Westinghouse turbojet engines mounted in the fuselage were supposed to power this thing through the sky. Armament included 4 20mm cannons and the ability to carry rockets or bombs. The cockpit was placed up front, giving the pilot a decent view. Landing gear retracted cleanly. Everything looked like a competent fighter design. But here's where it seems like Vought's engineers fell in love with their own concept. They prioritized raw speed and aesthetics over something quaint called stability and handling characteristics that don't actively try to kill you. Without a horizontal tail, pitch control was handled exclusively through small elevons mounted on the trailing edge of the delta wing. Elevons are basically movable surfaces that combine the functions of elevators and ailerons, which sounds efficient. Well, elevons at high speeds tend to be extremely sensitive. You move them an inch, the aircraft responds with a violent pitch change. Move them again to correct, and you've now overcorrected. Before you know it, the aircraft is oscillating like a ping pong ball and the pilot is just hanging on for dear life. The absence of conventional tail surfaces also meant the aircraft was prone to pitch up, a phenomenon where an aircraft's nose suddenly pitches up uncontrollably at high speed, often leading to a stall or worse. The Cutlass, with its unconventional control scheme, was particularly vulnerable to this. The first prototype the XF7U finally took to the skies on September 29, 1948, with Vought's chief test pilot J. Robert Baker at the controls. Early flights immediately revealed that the Cutlass was no ordinary aircraft. One prototype eventually hit 625 miles per hour, a respectable number on paper, but the reality was far less impressive. The Cutlass was underpowered. The Westinghouse J34 engines simply couldn't provide enough thrust for the aircraft's weight. Climb performance was sluggish, and pilots joked that the engines put out less heat than a Westinghouse toaster. The control system was a nightmare. Those sensitive elevons meant to manage pitch and roll instead triggered violent oscillations. As mentioned before, a tiny correction could send the aircraft into a hair-raising pitch and roll dance, leaving pilots fighting just to maintain level flight. Landing was a special kind of horror. The nose gear strut was so long, it lifted the cockpit 14 feet into the air, while the thin delta wings forced unusually high approach speeds. Combine that with twitchy controls and you have a plane pilots genuinely feared to bring down onto a carrier deck. And then there was the post-stall behavior. Enter a stall in the Cutlass and the aircraft could gyrate violently, completely ignoring standard recovery techniques. One test pilot, Lieutenant Murray Eloso, experienced this firsthand. His Cutlass went into a stall, tumbling toward the deck. Desperate, he let go of the stick to reach for the ejection handle, and in a bizarre twist, the aircraft self-corrected. Wind tunnel testing later confirmed what pilots had felt in the air. Normal stall recovery procedures did not apply. Instead, the Cutlass demanded a very specific combination of control inputs, a fatal mismatch between pilot training and aircraft behavior. Despite these glaring issues, production continued. In September 1949, the Navy ordered 88 F7U-2s, though by May 1950, F7U-1 production was halted at just 14 aircraft in favor of the upgraded F7U-3. None of those initial F7Us were approved for squadron service. This is where you see decision making guided more by hope and momentum than reality. Vought tried to fix the Cutlass. The F7U-3 featured a more powerful Westinghouse J46 engine with afterburners and strengthened and enlarged airframe, and better maintenance access through additional panels. But the fundamental problems remained. The Cutlass was inherently unstable and difficult to control. Carrier trials only amplified the issue. Pilots had to fight the aircraft to land it safely, and several were lost during approach. Then came the engine quirks. Early J34s were unreliable, prone to flameouts, overheating, or complete shutdown. But the strangest problem involved the aircraft's own guns. When pilots fired the four 20mm cannons, the muzzle blast could actually cause engine flameouts. Even famed aviator John Glenn encountered this. The solution was rather simple. Weapons expert George M. Shin designed a flameout eliminator, a device that redirected the cannon blast away from the engine intakes, much like a compensator or muzzle brake on a submachine gun. The J-34's unreliability meant pilots would never be sure whether the engines would actually work. Not exactly confidence-inspiring when trying to land on a moving aircraft carrier. As mentioned before, Vought eventually switched over to the more powerful J-46 engines with afterburners. But by that point, the Cutlass had already earned a grim reputation, with nicknames like Gutless Cutlass or Ensign Eliminator becoming commonplace. You know, there's a saying in aviation, an aircraft is only as good as a pilot who will willingly fly it. And by the mid-1950s, many Navy pilots avoided Cutlass squadrons whenever possible. Morale was low and the accident rate was astronomical. The dream of a sleek, revolutionary jet had collided head-on with the harsh realities of physics, engineering limits, and carrier operations. And here's the truth. The Cutlass wasn't built by bad engineers. Vought was a respected manufacturer with some of the most capable designers in the business. The problem wasn't incompetence. It was ambition colliding with the limits of technology. The tailless, swept Delta design looked like something decades ahead of its time, and in many ways, it was. but the technology simply wasn't there to make it work. Jet engines of the late 1940s lacked the power and reliability such an airframe demanded. Early flight control systems couldn't compensate for the unstable aerodynamics. Early tests revealed exactly that. The Cutlass suffered from violent pitch-up tendencies, hypersensitive controls, and unpredictable stalls. Test pilots repeatedly warned about these issues, but the company was too committed to the concept to backtrack. Instead of rethinking the fundamentals, they tried to engineer around the problems, tweaking, reinforcing, and refining, but never solving the core instability baked into the design. It's a classic case of elegant theory outpacing practical capability. The Cutlass's job was simple: be a reliable carrier-based fighter that could defend the fleet. In reality, it barely managed to do that, especially when flown from the confined pitching deck of a carrier. Meanwhile, its contemporaries, like the F-95 Panther, played it safer. They were conventional, stable, and trusted by their pilots. They didn't look as futuristic, but they worked. The Cutlass, for all its beauty, was a design waiting for technology that didn't exist yet. And in the end, the F7U Cutlass wasn't a failure of imagination. It was a failure of timing, a vision that came too early for the world it was built in, and a stark reminder that in aviation, being ahead of your time can be just as deadly as being behind it. Now let's talk a little bit about its operational history, because believe it or not, the Navy actually deployed the F7U Cutlass to operational squadrons. The first fleet squadron to receive the type was VF-81 in April 1954, but the reality was grim. Only a few squadrons flew the aircraft operationally, and many beached their Cutlasses ashore during parts of deployment because they were just too difficult to operate safely. Operational service was brief. Accidents continued to shock Navy leadership. By 1957, Vought analyzed the Cutlass's record: 78 accidents, with roughly 1/4 of the airframes lost, over 55,000 flight hours. This gave the Cutlass the highest accident rate of all Navy swept-wing fighters, and the crashes were often more severe than those involving other aircraft. Meanwhile, newer jets like the F8U Crusader were entering service. Sleek, powerful, and far easier to fly, pilots no longer had to wrestle with twitchy, unstable controls to survive a landing. By the late 1950s, the Navy began withdrawing the Cutlass from operational service. Vice Admiral Harold M. Beauty Martin, Air Commander of the Pacific Fleet, oversaw its replacement with the Grumman F9F-8 Cougar. Production had totaled roughly 200 aircraft across all variants, and many of the surplus airplanes were donated to municipalities and schools to promote aviation. The Cutlass flew few combat sorties, and those it did fly were unremarkable. By the 1960s, it was gone, not with a dramatic farewell, but with a quiet retirement and a collective sigh of relief from every single Navy pilot who had ever flown it. Although it had a relatively short service life, across its development, several major variants appeared. The XF7U-1 was the original prototype that first flew in 1948. The F7U-1 was the first production model, which was built in small numbers between 1950 and 52. Only 14 were produced, and none were actually approved for squadron service. By this point, the Navy already suspected the Cutlass might be too ambitious for carrier operations. The F7U-2 was a proposed improvement featuring upgraded engines and minor refinements, but it never advanced beyond the planning stages. The F7U-3 was the definitive production version. It was 1/3 larger than the prototypes, fitted with the more powerful Westinghouse J46 engine, and designed for easier maintenance. About 180 were built, but despite all these upgrades, the same old handling and reliability problems persisted. The last two major Cutlass variants were the F7U-3M and the F7U-3P, with the latter being a reconnaissance version, the former being a missile-capable version armed with AIM-7 Sparrow missiles. So why care about a fighter that barely lasted a decade and had one of the worst safety records in Navy history. Cause it fucking looks cool. I mean, look at the thing. I saw a picture of this for the first time a couple days ago, and I had to make a video about it because I had never seen anything like it. And when I searched it up and found out it's from the late 40s, early 50s, I genuinely couldn't believe it. Now, the Delta Wing concept itself wasn't inherently flawed. Other aircraft like the F-102 Delta Dagger proved that with careful design and attention to stability, Delta Wings could be highly effective. The problem with the Cutlass was how the concept was applied. Vought designers fell in love with the sleek, futuristic look and theoretical speed advantages. They ignored critical warning signs from test pilots, downplayed early stability problems, and failed to reconsider the airframe when prototypes revealed serious issues. Engineering elegance and ambition had completely overridden operational reality. And the truth is, the Cutlass wasn't a bad idea. It was just too early. The technology of the late 1940s simply couldn't support what Vought was trying to build. Jet engines weren't powerful or reliable enough. Control systems weren't advanced enough to manage a tailless Delta Wing fighter safely. In many ways, the Cutlass was a victim of its own ambition. It reached for a future that the materials, engines, and understanding of aerodynamics hadn't quite caught up to yet. And to me, that's what makes it so fascinating. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. If you stuck to the end, I appreciate it. And I'll see you on the next one.